Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here with us in person and to those of you who are online. My name is Richard Harper, and I'm a Director and Head of Rail Advisory here at Steer. And I've spent over 30 years delivering complex rail projects. And in that time, I've seen many examples of innovation and entrepreneurialism. So I'm delighted to host this discussion with our fantastic panel, which will be followed by some question and answers. If you're joining us online, please do add your questions to the comments section on your screen. Before I introduce our panel, I wanted to give a bit of context to this discussion and the programme of events it is part of. For anyone who isn't familiar with us, Steer is a global consultancy specialising in the critical services and infrastructure that makes the world work. We have been at the forefront of rail advisory for almost 50 years, advising private and public sector clients, shaping railways across the globe. We're therefore eager to join the Railway 200 celebrations, and this is the second event in our Beyond the Rails programme for 2025. So what's this important discussion all about? The story of railway innovation is a story of bold entrepreneurs, brilliant engineers, and forward-thinking investors. From engineers like Stevenson and Brunel, and entrepreneurs like Watkin and Hudson, who built the Victorian railways, to British Rail's innovators like Terry Miller, Bob Reid, and Chris Green, who transformed rail services, to more recent private sector innovators in the passenger and the freight sector, challenging traditional models. Innovation has always shaped how our railways develop. I grew up midway between the seat of the Industrial Revolution and a city which was a hotbed of Victorian innovation and ideas, Birmingham. At my school, their house system celebrated local entrepreneurs, including James Foster and John Rastrick, whose foundry still stands to this day. They manufactured the first steam locomotive to run on rails in America, the Stourbridge Lion. So a pioneering spirit in railways has always been with me from an early age, which means I'm particularly delighted to host this event. So how do Britain's railways continue to harness entrepreneurial spirit and the space to innovate? How should the government shape its collaboration with the sector to unlock creativity, investment, and a thriving economy? And what about elsewhere in the world? So now I'd like to introduce today's panel. Today we welcome Sir Andrew Haines, OBE, the CEO of Network Rail. With a career spanning senior roles in South West Trains, First Group and the Civil Aviation Authority, since 2018 he's been shaping the future of UK rail through his leadership at Network Rail, with a transformative agenda that puts passengers and freight users at the heart of operations, alongside establishing arrangements for the creation of Great British Railways. Shamit, Gaiger, OBE, Managing Director of West Coast Partnership Development, a powerful advocate for innovation and inclusivity in transport. Shamit's career spans government and industry, including roles at RSSB, the National Skills Academy for Rail, and as Chair of the Trustees for the Campaign for Better Transport. She's also President of the CILT Railway Study Forum and a Non-Executive Director of Women in Rail. Tim Shoveler, the CEO of Freightliner Group. Tim has over 30 years' experience in the rail industry, starting as a guard with British Rail and rising through leadership at Eurostar, East Midlands Trains, Stagecoach and Network Rail. He became the CEO of Freightliner Group in August 2023. So Tim brings unmatched frontline experience alongside his strategic perspective. Julia Prescot, CBE, co-founder of Meridiam and Deputy Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, an infrastructure visionary and policy influencer. Julia brings a global lens to our event, playing a key role in shaping long-term investment in the UK and beyond. Meridiam is notably the single largest investor in the Tours Bordeaux high-speed line. Julia also serves as chair of Neuconnect and Fulcrum Infrastructure and is co-chair of the Global Infrastructure Facility and an honorary professor at the Bartlett School, UCL. And finally, James Bain, Chief Operating Officer of Worldline globally. With a career shaping digital transformation in rail, James is set to share his powerful perspective on the future of mobility tech. From pioneering onboard EPOS systems at Virgin Trains to founding redspotted.hanky.com and leading Worldline's regional operations, James has been at the forefront of innovation in transport ticketing and payments, using technology to shape the passenger experience. So let's start, panel, by talking about the role of innovation and entrepreneurialism. If you could start, please, by giving us your views on the value that has to the rail sector, both now and in the future. And I'm going to come to each of you in turn, starting with Sir Andrew.
A bit like you, Richard, I grew up in a town where history was made through the railways. I mean, very few people remember Richard Trevethick, who actually constructed the first steam train that moved iron between different work sites in the Pendarren Iron Works, which is where I grew up. And so I have a very strong present sense of just how disruptive railways were, and for that purpose, that actually this was not some form of hobby. This was unbelievably hard-nosed, hard fought for, difficult, painful, but real entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think we need that now more than ever. I think we've been through a period where innovation has been especially hard in the railways, particularly in the post-COVID environment, where there has been both a shock to our revenue, but also a shock to our modus operandi, and we've ended up in a short-term contracting, very narrow horizons. And we're doing that in a fiscally constrained environment. The future cannot be spending our way to new railways alone. We are seeing, so apologies for anybody here from HS2, we are seeing the challenges of delivering new infrastructure, but also we are seeing the price we all pay when that turns out to be rather more expensive than everybody budgeted. So let's not kid ourselves that there is a way of spending our way to a growing, more successful, thriving railway for freight and passenger users. So the key has to be in innovation. We have the benefit, I think, of this moment, alongside those two negatives, of two real things. First of all, the enormous technological opportunity, which is artificial intelligence, and the fact that we're not even in the foothills of grasping that. And then secondly, I would say this, but I genuinely believe that GBR gives us an opportunity to innovate, because it separates the operating of the railway again from government to a degree, and it declutters all the contractualization, which has made innovation expensive, which has given people the wrong sort of incentives when it comes to innovate. And lastly, it deals with some of the regulatory burden, which is one of the other inhibitors to innovation. It will require an enormous cultural change. As Chief Executive of Network Rail, it would be rank hypocrisy for me to sit here and say and Network Rail is a lover of innovation and that we warmly embrace it and we GS slides through. I'm many things, but I'm not an intentional hypocrite. But the platform, Network Rail, is a function of the system within which it works. And if we set the right parameters within the overall system, and if we set the right leadership behaviors, then actually I think we can be transformative at this moment in our history.
Great, thank you. Shamit.
Thanks, Richard. So you kind of stole my thunder here. But maybe I'll break it and kind of have a slightly different perspective. But we need to both create kind of have innovation and entrepreneurship attitude both now and in the future. Now, because we are in a crossroad where GBR is going to be the only game in town, we all need to be behind it. And we all need to make sure that we do that in a way that makes the railway relevant now and in the future. In the environment where there is no funding, where the macroeconomics are changing at an hourly basis, significant impact on Treasury, significant then impact on our railway, where once we become part of the public sector, our license to operate will be literally, we have to be safe and we have to deliver to customers. And to be able to deliver to customers, it means we need to keep being relevant to the customers. Keep being relevant to the customers when we constantly have to have two things. One is innovate, and actually GBR, I think, will really enable that. It will enable that because it will give us a long-term perspective. 5-year settlements means we can have a long-term strategy. We mean understand our challenges better. We then mean we can innovate, answering exam question, then scale up, right, if we do it right. And then more pragmatically, it's that the contract issue where you have at the minute the cost and the benefits under different legal entities. You know, if I have the benefit and you have the cost, why on earth would you do it, right? Why will you even incentive? This just doesn't exist. So that will become really, really critical. The entrepreneurship aspect, I think, will I hope, become from a new GBR that will be, I hope, kind of customer focused at its heart, at its design and vision. Will need to have entrepreneurship and culture of growth. You cannot have a culture of growth if we are just going to be very compliant. So we need to really choose the right people that will then create that growth, keep innovation to be relevant to customers. And I think if we do that, we have a really good chance of being kind of really wonderful industry that we also can be. So that's kind of my thoughts at the minute. Thanks,
Shamit. Tim, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think this gets harder as we go along.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
But I mean, great comments from both Andrew and Shamit. You heard that I started my railway career right at the front line, so it won't surprise you to know that coupled with working with some fantastic leaders as I've grown up through my career means that I very strongly believe in a Devo Max world. You know, all of my experience is that leadership is about enabling the people at the front line who actually deliver our service in the dark at 1 o'clock in the morning at all the times that, you know, we're not here, frankly. Now, we know they can't do that on their own, but that requires an environment of high trust and high skill. This isn't a normal business, but it's one that's got huge opportunity. So the point about entrepreneurship, and I've been privileged throughout my career to work with some real entrepreneurs like Sir Brian Souter, and others, and watching their behaviours and seeing how we reflect that into the railway industry has been fascinating. Andrew and I were both privileged to work with South West Trains, and you could see very clearly how the drive that Brian had to make that business more than just a railway company, I think created, you know, ultimately what was a superb business. So how do we find that then in the world that we're moving into, where there's a risk, I guess, and I should say I'm a huge supporter of GBR and the principles, but there's a risk that it becomes a state monolith that's controlled by government. I mean, that's the risk. Well, actually, of course, it's about the creation of that profit and loss account, because I think that's what allows entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurs in our organisations to take advantage of being able to see clearly for the first time in a generation what the costs and what the income is of running a certain piece of railway. And that's a step change. And we've seen when we ran the South West Trains Alliance 10 years ago, some wonderful examples of how when you bring those things together, it does a couple of things. It empowers, and you know I'm big on that, but also it educates, because it allows people to ask questions and to see and to wonder why is it the case that costs that, and to understand more about the drivers of revenue or indeed the drivers of costs. All of that information has not been evident in the model we've had for the last 30 years, and that's a fundamental change. So I think that will create the environment where entrepreneurs can move forward. And then my last minute, I just want to talk about freight, because of course freight is private and will remain private, and my competitors are ruthlessly private. You know, there is nothing been so educational as understanding how the truck industry works, and I operate 250 of them. And when I compare the trucks that I operate compared to the railway that I operate, what an experience that has been. And I see that innovation and entrepreneurialism at a pace which leaves the railway standing. In just 4 months, our biggest customer, Maersk, has moved all of their ships from one port, Felixstowe, to another one at London Gateway. Okay, Now, we've completely rewritten our timetables with enormous help from Network Rail, and we've launched the services after 4 weeks. If we can do that for freight operators, we could do that for passengers too. So I think there is so much opportunity that I can see we can do when we have to go toe-to-toe with the competition. And the best way to make sure that our entrepreneurs of the railway in the future is to make sure they are focused toe-to-toe on the competition for both passengers and freight. We're going to have to fight really hard as an industry for every passenger and for every freight customer. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Well, I'm
So
going to
Julie.
go off in a slightly different direction.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about railway entrepreneurs, and I feel I'm a particularly good place to do that. On both sides of my family, I have ancestors who were rail entrepreneurs. One, the Brown family, who George Brown was particularly active in the Baltimore Ohio Railway, going back to the 1820s. And on the other side, Harold Bowen, who built most of the railways in Argentina and ended up by being the chairman of Buenos Aires and Southern Railway. Now, one of the questions was, what makes an entrepreneur? They were tough, well, the latter of Victorians or even pre-Victorians. And there's this great photograph of the great-grandfather in the middle of the pampas, you know, in front of his train with everybody, you know, digging away. You had to be tough, you had to be entrepreneurial in the very sense that you didn't necessarily know, you know, you were bringing everybody together to make this thing happen. And there's one particular anecdote which I'll give, is that looking through some of his correspondence, and I think this is particularly relevant, there was a letter from Baring Banks of London, dated about 1897. Dear sir, we note that your loan repayment may be a little bit late. We understand that there is inclement weather, that the passengers may not have been at the same level as they were, and that costs might have increased, but we would urge you to repay us. So these lessons that we have for entrepreneurs were the same in the 1820s, 1890s, and since that time. And what it really means when you look at the railway today, it's pretty clear that obviously GBR is being created. There are new schemes that people are looking at. There are new passenger services that people are looking at, and the ones that were announced today. But they're going to need a certain entrepreneurial activity. And how are they going to be able to deliver this? And I wanted to pick up, it's already been mentioned, pick up and talk about, because although I'm Deputy Chair, what is now, well, Deputy Chair of the NIC, we have now all become members of the Advisory Council of NISTA as of today. So I have to stop calling myself that. But one of the things that I did, in Investor, I co-founded an infrastructure fund. One of the key investments of Meridiam was to Bordeaux Railway. And how did that happen? That was a largely private sector. There was a lot of public sector support for it. It was a railway that cut journey times between Paris and Bordeaux by an hour. It led to a property explosion in Bordeaux. It actually meant that you got the private sector funding the construction of the railway. You got the private sector managing passengers, and we're talking about several millions a year. Now, how could we do that? We had a very clear revenue base. We were given what was between 19 and 8.5 trains a day, and those are the tolls on the trains. We were given certainty about that in the long term. The concession went from 2011 to 2061. We were actually in a position where we could contract with a single contractor, which is Vinci in this case, and everybody from HS2, it's the same length as from London to Birmingham. It costs €7 million, and it was done just about to time the budget. We said, no, HS2 is completely different. I do accept it is, but I make the point that contracting terms are incredibly important. Being tough and prepared to take risk. You know, old ancestor George Brown in the middle of Baltimore in 1827 was taking the same sort of risks that we were taking when we supported that railway, and the need to have investors who are prepared to take risk. Now, I could talk about Bordeaux for a very long time, and I don't want to go beyond my time limit, but I'm just looking at it from a slightly different perspective. It can be done. It's not impossible. We are in the right environment when there are opportunities to actually look at how we can be more entrepreneurial about building railways, as well as my colleagues have mentioned, being entrepreneurial within railways. And I think it's a really good topic to talk around. Thanks.
So over to you, James, to take us in another different direction, hopefully.
Yeah, so being last in line, I'll try my best to say something that hasn't been said already. I think I was born in Darlington, so I guess it's in the blood somewhere. And as a doughy-eyed 24-year-old, the first person I met in rail was Richard Branson. And I know some people may have different views, but I was deep soaked in innovation and the purpose of why we do what we do. And really the purpose from my perspective is about the customer, whether that's the human being or whether that's the freight customer. And actually the whole point of infrastructure is to make life better for the people of the country. One of my other roles is I chair the Rail Supply Group. That's a partnership with government, both DfT and DBT. That's primarily why I'm sat here right now rather than the Worldline slant on my career. But coming through my career to where we've got to today, and the railway itch is still scratching at me, as you can see, because I'm sat here. I think there must be going forward, as Andrew said, a culture change to be more open-minded around collaboration. I think it's really critical to focus on the output need and desire rather than the input want and dictatorial control. I think, what Julia's mentioned in terms of pushing through the Meridiam, contracting principles are fundamental. Cash is fundamental because nothing moves without cash. But I actually think bravery, so I'm sure most people in the room and most people online have an Amazon account. You have an Amazon account because Amazon focused on the customer and they really drove home taking risks at very small return for a significant period of time, that transformational cultural change. And I think from my perspective, the entrepreneurialism the private sector would want to bring in is some of that. And the ask, I'm going to turn it into an ask actually. The ask from the private sector side is to GBR, don't become the SRA, please. Let's be, from the get-go, open-minded about how we work together, the commercial deals that can be put in place, the timelines involved, the return on investment cycle, the open-mindedness. And if I take it to the technology aspect, yes, artificial intelligence, we are only in the foothills. Right now, it's only chatbots. Over the next 5 to 10 years, you will get quantum computing and you will get through the tech community the micronuclear reactors. That's an innovation and an entrepreneurial push that the artificial intelligence market will not grow without because the energy consumption needed is so high. So if they are looking that way, there are some waves that the rail sector can ride on top of in terms of how they move forward. So innovation doesn't have to be moonshots. It doesn't have to be silver bullets. And it can start slowly and it can build. But I think from my perspective, the piece I'd like to share is that let's do it together, focus on the output and the customer, freight and human, and hopefully build a better system going forward. So Richard, to you.
Thank you, James. So there's some really important themes here, I think, about the customer, about incentivization of investors and operating businesses, and also the role of government in all of that. So I'd like to explore some of those a little bit more. I wonder if, panel, you could give me some thoughts around if there are any particular technologies or approaches that you think would have the biggest transformative impact. One of you like to take that, James?
Perhaps? I mean, from my perspective, I'm obviously going to come from the point of data. I think from a rail sector perspective, we're exceptionally poor at understanding the value of data, collating, analysing, sharing. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that effort hasn't gone in, it absolutely has. But when I compare it to what I see in the retail sector, for example, we are still in the 19th century. The entrepreneurialism and the innovation around that, it is far easier to do today. It's cheaper because the tools are publicly available. And I think with some collaborative focus around that, we could really pick up the pace quite quickly. And it goes through, for example, the demand and supply. I used to be a revenue manager. I used to do all cats raiding for a hobby. not for a hobby because Chris Green made me. The data analysis and the ability to do the demand and the supply mapping. And actually, I'm going to talk passenger because I understand it more than I do freight. So apologies, Tim. But the ability to flex a timetable for a wet Monday afternoon in November compared to running the Operation Princess clock face cross-country timetable, for anyone who remembers the complexity of that, is where we should be looking. And what comes out of that is the learning. Final point on data, Richard, is there are many third-party data streams available that can be aggregated together. And I think we need to open our eyes to those and really listen to the innovators that are working with those, because they can bring significant value.
Thank you. Okay. So,
I mean,
yeah, go on.
well, I was actually going to pick up on Julia's point about entrepreneurship as solving a problem we have, but also bring in the collaboration element. So we have a legal target of 20, decarbonisation of our economy by 2050. We have several thousand diesel vehicles that need to be replaced, really, probably in the next 5 to 7 years, and we have no money to electrify the railway. We have third parties interested in creating renewable energy. We have investors potentially prepared to invest. We could fundamentally change how we electrify the railway and how we contract for the delivery of that by thinking just outside of our normal boxes. I mean, I'm actively involved in conversations at the moment with energy suppliers, investors, just talking about how might you bring an entirely different consortium of entities together, not to electrify for the sake of electrification, but because you're going to have to replace those diesel trains in any case. Can you create an opportunity to do something which works from an investment perspective that could genuinely be funded through private finance and avoids otherwise the taxpayer paying an enormous amount of some money for bespoke diesel trains, or or technology that's going to have probably a 5 to 10 year lifespan because it'll have been redundant in a few years. I think there's lots of opportunities like that that actually, frankly, financial challenge and people being on their uppers should encourage us to really grasp them quite differently.
I'm going to talk about a completely different type of technology. We're thinking of about financial technology, because I very much support that. But in order to get that investment, there need to be good, robust revenue models.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also those with longevity. Now, you can say, well, let's look at the other utility industries, let's look at regulated asset base. The issue about a regulated asset base is that you don't have a homogenous income. You have people who have choice as to whether or not they go on railways, and not all the time, as we saw during COVID, that they do. So what we need to think of is really strong ways in which you can get revenue. Now, my experience in France was, taking the toll of the trains, that you actually book trains on an annual basis, took the income from that, but you knew you were going to book. And the interesting parallels I'm thinking of between GBR and also SNCF, giving that reliability over the long term, could provide that. And I think that from the railway point of view, I think it's going to be important not necessarily to follow other utilities, financial technologies, but think of those that are relevant to the railway, but that are still going to sit with investors. Because we've got to crowd that capital in, because otherwise a lot of the things that you're talking about won't. So financial technology, but you weren't expecting that.
I think that's really important. Shamit.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on something you've said earlier around risk. And I think if we are private financing, because also what we want to create some kind of burning platforms, which we have in this area. I think some of the challenges that we have in our sector is the risk of failure is too high. The risk of failure, both financially and politically, is extremely difficult. And so it's difficult to find project managers and leaders that want to really embed innovations in the project, because both the Treasury, railway is a massive enabler of the economy. So the risk there is too high. We've seen it before. We've seen it on the West Coast. And then politically, the risk is still too high, as we've seen with some of the things in high speed too. So when we think about innovation and entrepreneurship, I think it's not just about addressing the barriers, but actually creating in GBR the right cultures and incentives to make innovation worthwhile. So actually, people would want to innovate because they can see the benefits, the uplift, not just the risks. I think that will become really critical if we are really trying to push some of those areas that you highlighted, right? You look at it and you say, it's impossible. I've got all these targets. I can't afford it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Yeah, so as we've evolved to talk about innovation and financial challenges and opportunities, I was reminded that Ashford International was built by British Rail in 1994, publicly funded. Probably funded on the basis of a toll that was paid by each passenger that was going to use the station. It's amazing, isn't it? It's how these things go around. So we've done it before, we can definitely do it again. John Lang, I think, supported it. And of course, one of the opportunities that brings is that the generally accepted, there's a discipline of capital investment that comes with private sector, which I think is, which I recognise. And I think that is something which the railway can benefit from. I think it's helpful to have that tension that we see. So I think there is plenty of opportunities for whether it be tolls, whether it be different funding structures. And of course, we do continue to fund ourselves. So, my shareholders have invested nearly £100 million in 10 years in locomotive depots, in locomotives, in all sorts of wagons and all sorts of things like that. And actually, that's why in creating the framework for GBR going forward, it's got to be one that supports investment. Because actually there is risk, and if you get it wrong, it can be very, very expensive. So I think we just need to keep an eye on the framework that we're creating is supportive for investment, but also that the risks are tolerable.
So let's just explore that a little bit further. So have we forgotten, models that in the past have worked in terms of the allocation of risk and reward with the private sector, or are there some things about our industry funding structure that are now barriers that weren't there previously?
I think a couple of things. One, up until certainly last few months, Treasury appetite for private finance initiative type things was really for the last decade has been very, very limited. Roles are very tight on that. And talking to one of the perm sections of the Treasury about this on Friday, whenever we look at alternative means of funding, we have to put forward the counterfactual of it being publicly funded, even though we know there's no money to publicly fund it. And and we spend a lot of time doing that. Let's pretend that but I think the other thing that is true as well, and I'd be interested in Julia's take on this. We've had support for several years now to privately finance the replacement of our telecoms network by fiber optic, 5G, so that, and we've managed to persuade the Treasury of that because the investors will be taking risk on the spare capacity. We only need about 20% of the fibers. But actually, what I've observed in that is actually that the people want real certainty. Actually, investors are not up for, unless there are real rates of return, investors are not up for big risk. And so actually you've got to find a way of packaging that takes much of the risk out, leaves them with some risk, because otherwise you can't justify it to Treasury. But if there's too much risk there, you won't in practice you find it very hard to land billions of pounds worth of private finance. Not surprisingly, because a lot of these people are pension funds that need stable income. And they're not looking for absurd returns, but they are looking for reliable, decent returns. So you've got to find something that works for both sides in that area.
And
So the right amount of risk.
Yes.
Yeah. So the right amount of risk, but then the right amount of secure confidence. Is there anything you want to add to that, Julia?
I think it's very, very interesting the way the sort of world turns. I have to admit, I was advising the Department of Transport in those days in the 1990s on what was then the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. And at that stage, it was all moving into the private sector. And there was more preparedness and it was an idea. And then we've had the swing back into private sector bad, public sector good. And then because of the cost of capital and because of the various assumptions around risk that were being asked for from the private sector. And I think we're beginning to see that swing back again. So, you know, these goes in cycles. The issues really are, to what extent are you going to support that longevity? I mean, what I find quite interesting, three things. First of all, Tour Bordeaux, 2011, 2061. It's a really long period of time over which you can collapse, you can recover, it's your risk.
Yeah.
But it actually gives you a stable background on that. The features that I have been seeing, particularly there are new models of business models coming through in the water sector, known as directly procured contracts, and there's an acronym called the SIP, I'll talk about the sounds for a second. What they're talking about there, a 25-year concession. Well, they're not concession, they're more contracts to be entered into. And that's moving from a classical 5-year normal regulatory picture. We're also seeing the same thing in relation to electricity transmission, which are for the onshore transmission lines. And again, we're seeing 25-year periods. And I think that's really recognizing if you want to get the private sector in, they need to have that degree of certainty. Yep. They can live with potential changes in return. They can live with risk, but they can't live with, oh, we're going to stop this tomorrow and not getting any compensation. And I think that is something that we've got to really, going forward, we've got to balance between the two.
Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about government's role at a more general level, but what about at a more specific level in terms of fostering innovation? So I've got a background in the last decade in the franchise bidding sphere for UK Rail, where bidders were invited to demonstrate their innovation process. And there was nothing about actually what is the innovation you're going to generate to improve the value of the business. So what should government do? What role should government play to actually foster those innovative approaches that we all need and want to see?
Do nothing. Step back. Look, it's a high-risk industry, removing lots of people, the speed, on track, on metal. Government is not very good at being innovative and in high-risk industries, right? What the government should do is enable the framework for the industry to have a long-term view, to have a pipeline and clarity on challenges so they can get supply chain, to enable the industry to have the right frameworks for contracts. So it's all about delivery, not about schedule and volume. To enable, Treasury needs to set up a framework for private financing. It's all very good. They want it. How? How is that going to happen? And actually step back. Let the people who are closest to where the problems are and to the supply chain to innovate. That's how we grow the economy. We're not going to grow the economy by DFT or Treasury or Bays. It's a different name, I think. I got some Bays anymore, is it? Thank you.
DBT now.
DBT. To innovate, they just really let the SMEs come with the innovation. Let the frameworks do their work.
If I could just,
No, you're not, please.
I would just build on what Shamit said, I think critically GBR has to be set some really challenging revenue targets, but then some space to deliver against them. One of the not so nice things I have to do in my job is say no to innovators who want to sell me things I don't want to buy. And there is quite a lot of that. And you do have to learn to say, yeah, I know it's a really good product, but it doesn't fit my budget, my business plans, my priorities. But what you can do is say, look, this is what I need. But you can only do that if you've got some, you're given the chance to optimize your P&L, and then government bans the word governance. I now play governance bingo. How many times in a day do I read in departmental papers the word governance? It's the answer to every problem. But of course, it's not. It is the thing that kills. Tim's already talked about the fact we both work for Brian Suter. Brian Suter used to say he hated the banned the word process. Never mind governance. He said process was the death of creativity and can do. Now, I disagreed with him on that when it comes to running a railway and a timetable. But you know, governance is the curse of entrepreneurship.
Can I take issue with that?
Yeah, but only if you allow me to give you my experience of governance from a departmental perspective. That's all.
I can understand your
Yeah,
theories.
yeah.
I do think there are some positive aspects about getting the right governance structure in for delivering certain
Of course.
pieces
Yep.
of
Yeah,
infrastructure.
no, indeed.
And I'm very heartened by the way the whole structure of, for example, development corporations is coming forward and the additional powers that are being given. Because to me, and in a way, it's actually talking a little bit about the same thing. That is carving out an area
Space.
and saying, you know, go do it. Those are your rules. And to keep that governance separate from overarching governance is beneficial.
Yeah.
So I won't argue with you completely, but I will take issue with that.
I think I'm going to. I
to.
think I'll be saying a similar thing, which is you. I mean, if you're going to deliver these things, you need really good control. I mean, investors don't step away, do they? Far from it. Investors are some of the most invasive in their inquiries.
Oh, yes.
But my point was, I think there is a civil service solution that there's no problem that can't be fixed by governance. And I think that's what's stifling of innovation. And it's not the Department for Transport. I think it is. I think it's quite structural. We see it across our economy.
Right, I'm going to come to James and then Tim. James.
Just sharing from our perspective, being the bad guys on the private sector side that keep all the money. The Rail Supply Group has worked and is working to implement an innovation charter across the industry. And it's a set of guiding principles to try and coalesce outside of governance a motion of collaboration to get this innovation and entrepreneurial spirit moving. And I'm going to come back to what I said in my 4 or 5 minute introduction. I do think we spend a lot of time looking at the numbers, rightly, because eventually things have to be paid for. But ultimately, we need to really focus on the outcome and what are we trying to achieve. Rail is the backbone of moving people around the country. There are many other interfaces into and out of that system, this system. There are many other private sectors, and Julia mentioned some particularly around the utilities, but many private sectors in the retail space particularly that could be brought into the fold for cross innovation with the billions of journeys that flow through stations and cities. There are other transport networks that could be integrated more deeply from an innovative perspective into mobilizing people around the country. I do think that human beings have to be connected, and we are pack animals, so therefore people will continue to move. I don't subscribe to the 100% work from home initiative, and I'm assuming no one in the room or online does either. But I do think that, and I'm sorry for labouring the point, the open collaboration, the honest conversation between public and private sector of what is the challenge, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and if I may be so blunt, the public sector stop telling the private sector how to solve it, because they've got no idea. Really no idea. And I just wanted to share that. And if anyone wants to be involved, see this innovation charter work that hasn't, more than happy to share it.
Tim.
So you asked the question, what's the role for government? I completely agree with Shamit that once government has established the rules of the new system, the game that they want people to play, get out of the way. I think we've all established there's not a role for government in this. I'd like to see competition to be a really important part of that, because I think competition leads to innovation. I really am quite allergic to innovation for innovation's sake. I have to say, it really winds me up. Not least because, Andrew, you talked about innovations that we don't need or want. I've seen so many innovations that just don't work. And we spend such a lot of time and energy burning all this goodness innovation. No, competition will lead to the innovation. And that may mean that some innovation won't be needed. I mean, it's fine. We can't be so risk averse that we only innovate if we know it's going to be successful. That defeats the whole point, doesn't it? But we must make sure that it's for a purpose. What is the purpose of this innovation? what is the value of it? And I think we get that through competition when there's a real clarity in terms of the objective we're trying to achieve, whether that's cheaper cost, there's more passengers, less carbon, whatever it is. But let's be really focused on the objective that we want innovation to help us to do.
Can I say also the obvious that maybe, I'm sorry, it's pretty obvious, but probably worth saying. If you think about the risk of innovation, and this is kind of, and it's at the end of the day, people's job, the cost of failure is too much in our sector, against both politically and financially. We need to allow people to fail. And that's really hard. It's really hard in our environments because, the evening standard test, because of the politician, because it impacts real people. So we need to identify the areas we want to innovate, the objective, the challenges, and then allowing people to innovate and potentially fail. And that is hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but we have to find a way to do that, because otherwise, who will take the risk and why?
And can we be really clear where we don't want to take? So I was responsible
agree.
for a signalling system that was installed somewhere, which I won't mention, which was very innovative and horrifically unreliable. Okay, brilliant, great innovation, very unreliable. That is not the right place to experiment. So I think let's be clear what we want and where we want it.
The next time you're stuck in a signal failure on the Portsmouth area, you'll know what I'm talking about. Yeah. And it's being replaced after less than 15 years.
Well,
It has the shortest lifespan of any known signal system.
and there we go. Yeah.
We've asked all of you to
And no refund.
Can't believe it.
No refund.
we've asked all of you to identify an innovator or entrepreneur who you relate to, and some of you have already started talking about them in your introductions. So I think I'd just like to come to each of you, and we'll start with James at this end, in terms of who that individual might be. But really, what lessons can today's rail leaders learn from those historic innovators? So, James, you start us off.
Well, I've already mentioned the innovator, the entrepreneur that sparked my imagination around rail, and appreciate he may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was Sir Richard Branson, I think, and he was very similar to Brian Souter in the way that he went about it. There was a saying inside which I won't repeat because it will paint the airwaves blue, but the way that he drove the teams to only focus on the output, what are we doing for the customer? How are we making sure that the trains are on time and right time? How are we making sure the trains are clean? How are we making sure the tickets are sold? How are we delighting them as they come through the system so they come back again? And so they really trust what they're buying, what they're paying for. And ultimately, the rail industry sells time. It's a time promise that we sell, nothing else. And the commitment is A to B. There are very few, I mean, there are some. There are very few people that go on the railway just for the sheer fun of it. I'll leave it at that. But we do sell time, and we have to deliver that time promise. And by keeping that at the forefront of the mind from the work that we do corporately and some of the work we do around the Rail Supply Group table, it's really critical. And he was the one that taught me the value of time, if I'm honest. And we're only here for so much time. A lot of the innovators are no longer here. A lot of the innovators have not been born. So from my perspective, it was Sir Richard Branson.
Thank you. Julia?
I wouldn't go for a particular name, but I would go for a group of people who were so passionate about delivering railways and, as I said, my examples going back to the 18-somethings to today, that they were actually prepared to put their money behind it. And I mentioned a couple of names, other names have been mentioned around the room. And if I take that forward into the 21st century, I'm also talking about people, for example, in France, which was a notoriously public sector entity, who pushed through the idea that you can get this railway done because you can get the private money going into it. And I think that we ought to be trying to grasp that desire to deliver through using the mechanisms that we can see that we've got in the past from the really great entrepreneurs that have existed. Can I just mention something?
Yes,
I was going to mention it at the other end. we always have to remember, and this is a bit dangerous in a room of what looks like railwaymen, a minute proportion of the population actually travels on rail in this country.
Absolutely.
So therefore, you have to have people with passion. You have to have, announcements today about, alternative uses of the Eurostar that, you get organisation by Gemini, rather small, but the passion is still there. And we have to harness that passion because otherwise people are going to say, what's the point of the 6% or whatever it is, actually continuing to travel on railways. They want slightly off piece, but with intent.
Thank you.
I suppose that'd make room for freight then, wouldn't it?
Well, there you go.
Tim.
So yeah, I've already talked about Brian. So I think the group of railway people and entrepreneurs that I grew up looking at were people like Chris Green, like Cyril Beesdale, like Sir Bob Reed, both of them actually, who I think transformed a network in 10 years. In just 10 years, they took what was British Rail, much loved by some but not many, and turned it into a profit sector focused, customer facing business. It was quite a remarkable achievement. It's well documented if you want to read it, but literally in 10 years, and actually set up many of the things which I think allowed the train operating companies to be successful in the early years of privatization. Many of the things I think came from that, and and I think what was it about it? Well, because actually they had the ability to act fast, make decisions, and apologize when they got it wrong. So in a way that is just foreign from the way that we have to run the railway today, I'm afraid. The idea of being able to create a new fares structure, the idea of being able to, which they did, the idea of being able to start to move the terms and conditions of employees towards something that was much more focused on what the businesses needed. That job wasn't finished because the railways got broken up, but it was on a journey, and there's a lot of value in that. And that's when I think, with the new structures we move forward, the way that GBR competes within itself, the way the different regions look at each other, the way they are seen to be competing, and that might be for funds as well as for success, is really important. No doubt that part of that period was successful because there wasn't enough capital. We're probably back there now, and therefore only the projects that had the best return and were most holistic in their approach got the funding. And that feels like a world that's very relevant to where we are.
Yeah, very good. Shamit, where does this take you?
So I was kind of on a personal note, probably my mom, who is a massive entrepreneur, who had 4 kids and a whole lot of shops and was doing so much, but probably I'm not going to bore you with that detail. Happy to have discuss this later. She's really formidable, my mom. Even now at her 80s, but for me, when I thought about it, I thought, okay, so kind of innovation, move fast, break things, do or die, that kind of thing. And we are really not in that sector, right? We're a highly regulated sector. That's not really going to work for us. We need to kind of read the room, right? And so I thought, actually, what really works for railway is the second movers, because the first movers have a high risk of R&D, they have the high risk of commercialization, and it's really difficult within our sector to do that. But the second mover are really where things get exciting, because you already capitalize on the mistakes of the first mover, you reduced your costs, and it's proven technology, so you kind of really get in. And then I kind of wrote a list and I thought, kind of, who are really good second movers? And honestly, I was really surprised. I Googled this, so don't take any credit for that. But MySpace, that was the first mover. It's now Facebook, so Mark Zuckerberg for you. Alta Vista, if anyone remember that, it's the second mover was Google. Converse, Nike, BlackBerry, iPhone, Apple, etc. The list goes on. It's really quite interesting. Couch surfing is now Airbnb. So obviously different companies, but first movers didn't really quite make it. But the second movers, the fast movers, whatever you want to call it, were really kind of able to upscale and kind of really capitalize on the market. So that's my kind of thoughts on that.
Wonderful.
Thank you. And lastly, Andrew.
A bit left field, maybe, but I've been reading a book about on sort of Jungian psychology and psychiatry. And it really resonated with me, because Jung says that if you want a personal breakthrough, the thing that really differentiates you is first insight about what you need to do, then courage to do it. But the ultimate breakthrough is the endurance to see it through. And I thought the people I tend to have really admired were the people who had the endurance. And if you think about Richard Trevithick, I mentioned actually breakthrough. But the reason I got on so well when I was working with Brian Suter was because Brian never gave up. And Brian was prepared to put money at stake for things he believed in. And he was prepared to do the right thing and see it through. And at the other end of the scale, a woman I only met a few times, Jane Priestman, who was the director of architecture and design. The lot dying days of British Railway, if you ever met her, a phenomenally formidable individual, but utterly passionate about design and utterly unforgiving in having her own way. Unfortunately, her own way was brilliant, but she had the endurance, you know, and I'm pretty sure that apart from the time when Prue Leith was an advisor to the BR board, she was the only woman, you know, in a very, very white male dominated environment. And she got her way because she was expert at what she did. She believed in it. She was passionate, and she was prepared to endure till the end. And I think that's one of the big differentiators. The really successful entrepreneurs, sometimes they have astonishing luck, but very, very often it's as well because they have the capacity to endure when the rest of us sometimes fall by the wayside.
Really good. Right. I'm going to just return us back to something that we started talking about right at the beginning, which to me feels like it's something that has been part of the conversation this evening, and really pleased to hear it part of the conversation, but isn't part of the conversation perhaps often enough, which is the customer perspective. So I'd like just to return to that and just ask each of you to just expand a bit more on how the customer perspective can help shape innovation going forward. Shamit, would you like to start?
Sure. So where do you start? Look, I'm everything we do, everything I do is all literally start with the customer. Everything we do, test with the customer. I think I started by saying, I think GBR design, and I mean it in its most meaningful way, have to start with the customer at its heart, and not just about the delivery of the services. It goes all the way to the back office. It's about decision making. It's about, you know, having a P&L that enables you to see where the growth is, where the pain points are, then you really go and invest there. And that goes into reliability, right? And into all those things. To understanding intimately the future customer is going to be vital for us if we are going to be relevant and keep that 7% and keep our license to operate from Treasury. Because we're all going to be funded by public money, and the Treasury will have to make a decision whether they're going to invest in schools, in hospitals, or in railway. That is going to be the reality we're going to find ourselves in. So innovation around addressing the customer pain points, getting personalization, which is, by the way, now a hygiene factor. You know, if we think personalization is really AI, really exciting, it is not. It's what the expectations are. People, you know, we know now that Gen Z, and increasingly probably Gen Alpha, though we don't know enough about them, are willing to pay for a experience. They're willing to share data if they get something in return for it. We know that 40% of revenue can go up if you do personalization really well. All of those things are real, you know, and it all starts with the hygiene factor. What I found really interesting recently is start looking at the net scores for passenger satisfaction. It's supposed to be long-term. It's supposed to help us understand brand. And then it sort of landed on me a few days ago, and I apologize for those who, actually brand doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is us addressing the pain points, is delivering customer service, is knowing the customers and delivering for them in, day out. Because like the NHS, they only appreciate when things go wrong and we deliver it right. And so I think pain points, personalization, and designing GBR innovatively from a customer perspective around the operations is really critical.
So, Tim, what's the customer perspective from Freight?
Well, it's fascinating because, of course, in some of the train companies that run used to have hundreds of thousands of passengers a day, and there were challenges to that. Whereas in terms of customers and freight, then really I've got about 20. And suddenly the conversation that you have with the customer changes very considerably when you've got 20 customers, especially when they're due to contract renew, because you can't afford to lose their customer. The relationship changes and becomes, I think, much more personal, if you like, and the need to understand the business of the customer becomes essential. So I've really gone out my way to try and understand and learn about that, and that's been fascinating. When I talk to the chief executives of some of the large aggregates companies, for example, and you think that rail moving stone, that's kind of where rail should play a strong space, isn't it?
Yeah.
We should be good at that. I think we are good at it. When you actually talk to the CEO of one of the large aggregates companies, and you say, well, actually, what's on your agenda? Where do I fit into that? How can we work together? I was quite surprised to find out I didn't. We were sort of part of. We were actually just part of the. Well, but you're a contractor. I hire people to place dynamite to blow the lines, to blow the rock face, and I hire people to move it to the quarry. So we were quite a long way down the list of important. I thought we were really critical, and actually it turned out we weren't as important as we thought we were, and we're also a lot more replaceable. Because actually, pretty much most of what we do in the UK can go by truck, and in that regard, our ability to the requirement for us to deliver what the customer wants when the customer wants it at a price that they're prepared to pay is absolutely acute. And if we don't get that right, they can and they do just go by road instead. So part of the challenge here is actually there's a strategic thing about how do we actually create an economic system that favours rail as opposed to road, which is obviously where we are just now. Great report that Steer wrote for the rail partners recently, which illustrated that beautifully. So we've got to change the economics if we're going to be successful. But as a rail industry, we've got to understand much more about what the subtleties of what our customers need and what worries them. The idea that a freight train can be delayed a couple of hours because of the fact that there's been an incident, that's not okay. But the fact that actually there are times of year when freight has different elasticities. So October to Christmas is typically the busiest time for both construction traffic and intermodal traffic. So don't talk to me about closing the railway between September and December. But I will talk about what we can do in January and February. And there's some that's quite obvious from my perspective now. I think I learned that during the lines, but actually it's not something which is a currency that I think we're aware of. So let me summarise. Of course, in a very different context to passengers, but the need of the customer is just as critical. They've got absolutely as much choice, if not more, than passengers, and they can move their goods and services elsewhere. But if we get it right, and where we get it right, there's a fantastic opportunity to build long-term, enduring relationships that critically allow investment, often by the customer, into the railway or into our facilities. And again, that's a rather different approach for passengers. And look, in Europe, we operate trains in Europe in 3 countries, and I can see how that's different because of the fact that that some of the structures are different and the capability of the railway is different. We just launched a new train from Rotterdam to Poland, carries 38 trailers, lorry road trailers, just drive straight on, and it's there, overnight. There are some things that rail can do that we need to keep trying to learn to do here.
Very good, thank you. Right, anyone else on the panel just want to come in on that?
Well, I was actually going to talk about investors, and I think that I'm talking about investment from the point of view of Meridiam, because Meridiam's a 25-year-long fund and hasn't to date sold any assets. So for 25 years, we have the same customers. We are providing infrastructure as a service to those customers. And whether it be rail or light rail or road or all the other infrastructure that we invest in 19 countries around the world, the customer and the quality of service is absolutely critical. Where things go wrong is when the customer doesn't get the service they expect. And you can all see that on the railway. That if you And let's face it, in this country, the customer has not got the service they expect in water. And so therefore there is a huge amount of resistance to investment. So I think if you're going to having private sector investment, it's an absolute hygiene factor. You have to have good customer relationships. And sometimes that gets a little bit lost in the discussions about, weighted average cost of capital and returns and all the rest of it. That's meaningless if you don't have a happy customer. And if you hold on to them for a long time, you have to ensure that every year.
Thank you. Right. Yeah, James.
So just final point from my perspective, and it kind of links to what Shamit was saying. We need to open our eyes to the customer of tomorrow, whether it's Gen Z or Gen Alpha or whatever other tag we're going to give them. And, I don't mean to be rude with what I'm about to say, and I include myself in this. Looking around the room, and I can't see you online, I'm not sure there's anyone here that was born in this century. That's the first point. Second point, there is one in the room. Yes, thank you very much. And that's normally what happens when I ask that question. Second point, the children of today will probably, more than likely, through transformation of society, see in the next century in the Western world. 75 years ago was 1950. Doesn't feel that long ago when you say it like that. And I do think we have to bring a focus in. And there's one thing that I would ask of GBR as it is set up. And this isn't meant to be a pun. So excuse me before I say it, but it would be really amazing if GBR implemented a shadow board of younger people within their ecosystem of, sorry, Andrew, governance, that were given the challenge to look at the customer of today and tomorrow. I'm too old for it now. I've got a grandson now as well. So, that would be the final point I would make, is look forward and embrace the talent and the youth of today.
Andrew, any final remarks on customers from you before we move to Q&A?
Well, Tim and I can go months without seeing each other, and this is our second panel we've been on today. And the other one was about what does the customer mean, and I didn't realise I was meant to be the keynote speaker until Tim told me 2 minutes beforehand. So I had to speak on my feet, in one sense, it was really easy because I genuinely believe in my DNA that the railway regains its purpose in being a sector that focuses on the end user, then actually that of itself is transformational. So the customer is the why. The customer is also the how, is how we get out of a negative cycle of being over-dependent upon public subsidy at a time when there's lots of other capability as well. And it's also the what, in that, as several people have said today, we have this once-in-a-generation opportunity to set up GBR, and it ought to be the single most important lens that we evaluate the proposals for setting GBR up against. How does it allow capable, professional, fully accountable people to deliver for the end user and create that virtuous circle?
Great, thank you. Right, we're now going to move to our question and answer part of the session, taking questions both in the room here and from those online. And my colleague Mike Goggin will be fielding the latter for me. But I'm going to start by taking a couple of questions from the room. Can you just wait for the microphone, and can you say who you are, where you're from, and if you've got a specific question for any of the panelists that you'd like to alert, or if it's a general question, if you could just make that clear as well. So who's got a question for the panel? Over here.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you, panel, for a great talk. My name's Rob Brighouse. It's hard to say where I'm from, really. I do a variety of things. You talked to start about entrepreneurs from the Black Country and Wales and Baltimore, and they had to fight the sort of court of public opinion because horse-drawn stagecoaches were fine, canals were fine, you didn't need Tim Shoveler. Today, the entrepreneurs have to fight, to my mind, they have to fight bureaucracy, whether that's Network Rail, DFT, or wider government. So looking through the eyes of the smaller entrepreneurs, where cash flow is king, we've talked about what's needed, but how can GBR shape itself to allow people in government, and this is countercultural for them, to do what Shamit said and to fail quickly? And can GBR set KPIs for the people in the organisation to achieve a certain number of failures per year? Because that could drive the innovation that's needed. So mainly aimed at Andrew, I guess. How do we get GBR to change the culture that allows failure to be acceptable, coming from organisations where failure today is not acceptable? And I'm not talking about systems like the one Tim put in, but I'm talking about innovative ideas. Thank you.
So, two things. First of all, as I said, we've got to create the framework that facilitates that. The bits of the network world culture that people don't like are entirely predictable consequence of the way it's set up, the incentives it's given, the way it's governed, the way it's regulated. So if you repeat all of those things, it's a complete idiocy to think you'll get a very different type of culture at the end. The very specific thing we're doing in the context of innovation is setting up something called GBRX, which is precisely to recognize that there's a rational risk-averse culture in parts of the railway, and we need to create an environment whereby people can fail fast and have clients with a much greater risk appetite, but also critically as well, that can filter out some of these things so that entrepreneurs for whom cash is king do not waste money on things which the railway is never going to abide. And so actually provides a filter, provides a safe space, but also provides an intelligent sponsor that's got appetite to back these things. We've actually got a really good advisory panel as well, who's really challenging us now. We build in that literally as we speak, to hold us to account for actually being at the cutting edge, but also for allowing people to fail. Yeah.
Right, do we have another question? Over here.
Yeah, thanks very much. So Ross Cooney-Reed, I work for Infra Capital Partners. So we're a private sector investor in critical infrastructure, much like Meridiam, and we invest in many similar projects. We're also the majority shareholder in High Speed 1, now called London St Pancras High Speed. And I guess I've got a similar but potentially more blunt question. It's really encouraging to hear the whole panel advocating for the role of private sector investment in our industry. I think what we've seen over many years is that there are many good ideas, and that eventually we get blocked by a very small number of individuals, either in the civil service or in the political sphere. So I guess my question really to the whole panel is, despite a lot of willing across the industry and a lot of desire to really channel private sector investment into this industry, how do we unlock the use of that capital by targeting those individuals, and how do we convince them that there is a really vital role to play in this country?
Okay, who wants to take that?
Ross, I find it difficult to be very specific about this just becoming a council advisory member of the advisory council of NISTA. So it's a little difficult to talk about targeting people, but I mean, I think it's certainly very important when we want to see the drivers of growth that infrastructure development is one of those huge drivers. Actually, how that is going to take place, and when government money is so constrained, alternatives will need to be thought about. And I don't think it's a black and white in terms of those alternatives. I think we're going to have to see how far they actually fit in to the needs of the time. And there are new models coming through that people are looking at more closely. There's, I mean, don't have to tell you what the public finances are. It is something that will need to evolve. And I think the more evidence that comes in, the more detail, the argument is ready to have.
Can I just very briefly supplement that by saying it's political leadership we need in that space. So civil servants will flex to different political demands. The resistance you've seen over the last decade, a lot of it relates from the sort of Philip Hammond era, and even before that, I remember talking to John Kingman, raging against the
George Osborne, and his Christmas trees.
Yeah, raging against the Thames Tideway model, where the sort of because of the Treasury as a backstop. Now, people these days say actually it's an exemplary model of how actually the Treasury normally took risk, but actually has allowed relatively efficient capital.
Okay.
Okay.
But anyway,
But-
that's a point of discussion.
But actually, that was being used as a reason never to do it again. What I see, certainly, what I see here and these days is people being much more open to that, and that's all because of political shift.
I think there's also an international shift. I mean, I think that this country is one that is been in itself an island of non-public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
When we've seen them blossom all
Yeah,
over the
yeah,
world, and we've seen infrastructure being developed there. And the poor gentleman who's been promoting PPP abroad on behalf of the Treasury and comes back and says doesn't exist here, can hopefully now feel more comfortable having two personalities. Things are changing. Things have got to change. We've got to achieve growth. We've got to find the tools that we can.
I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I completely agree with the macro context. If like, I make that a little bit more micro. So in our European businesses, if we want to run on a certain bit of railway, then my train needs to have ETCS in cab signaling. So if it hasn't got it, I have to fit it. But the cost of running on the road is really cheap. Whereas in the UK, the cost of running on the road is really expensive, but Andrew's paying for me to have ETCS fitted.
I think you'll find it's this lot here as taxpayers.
So-
You're all paying for Tim's.
and we're all paying for ETCS, and all of the costs that go with that, and all of the incentives that go with that. So actually, of course, we've created a system.
Should we ask the unit cost you're charging me versus the unit cost you charge
Do you know,
yourself?
we've
the other
got one
country,
loco fitted. I mean, the irony is we're not making the progress.
No, I know.
We're
Absolutely.
not making progress. In Rotterdam, there's a 50-kilometre section of railway in the port that's got ETCS, and my shunting locomotives have got ETCS on them. Right? I've got one loco in the UK that's got ETCS on it. So we're just going back to your point about technology, and that really will make a difference for passengers. Man, goodness, if there's one thing that we can do that will make a difference to the cost of running the railway, improve safety, but really transform what we offer the passenger, especially when things go wrong, is ETCS.
Absolutely.
So to your point, I think there are some really specific models, and I remember in CP6, CP7, didn't we try to ask Treasury to allow the Roscos to fund the fitment? Because it's natural, isn't it, that the Roscos who own the train should fit the ETCS. They pay for everything else that goes on the train, apart from ETCS. So let's understand where those big wins are and move fast on them. And I think hopefully with the political environment we've been talking about, maybe that's an opportunity now. It was just a couple of years ago.
And Shamit?
Yeah, it's probably worth me reflecting on some of the work we've done on the sector deal, where we tried to, this is 2 governments ago, where we were trying to, though at the time, government changed very quickly, so it's probably...
I think it was 4 governments
Yeah.
ago. You've lost
It was.
Editor Theresa May, that's
Yes, it was. That was 4 governments. 5 governments.
Yeah.
I'm glad they were correct. But I get what I was trying to say. We had quite a lot of discussions with Treasury at the time around private investment and what that look. And quite frankly, Treasury is really schizophrenic about it. On the one hand, there's no money, and today they need the private. On the other hand, they'll tell you, well, we can borrow cheaper. And so there needs to be the leadership and the mechanism to do that. And Treasury has to work through a mechanism to do that. What the private sector, the financier, needs to do is 2 things. A, you have to focus on the end customer and the end user and make sure it's relevant, because otherwise your investment won't be worthwhile, because the needs change and you're kind of stuck with it. The second thing is, once we do that, because private financing has such a bad rep with the public, you need to make sure that when you go to Treasury, when you start changing the landscape to enable your private financing, have the right contract and makes the community. So it's the end user, it's the you as the owner of the assets will benefit, but actually then the community benefits. And this way, and constant engagement on the benefits that people get out of your private investment, growth, the local community, the technology, the innovation, etc. Otherwise, we're going to go back all circle again, you know, because it's difficult for the public to accept.
Can I just have a quick shout out for a new model that is coming through that is actually delivering infrastructure in Wales at the moment, which is something called the mutual investment model.
Yeah.
And that actually has 80% private ownership, 20% public ownership. It is off balance sheet in the context of the Welsh balance sheet, but it also has built-in requirements to fulfill numbers of apprenticeships, environmental services, long-term delivery, safety. And those models are actually ones that seem to move in the right direction from the point of view of private financing. And it does seem to me that we've got to, with private financing, if you say that and wrong is wrong, let's solve that and that. You know, it's not beyond a man. We don't have to live in a box. And so therefore, that will then give us models like, as I said, this mutual investment model that should really help us, not only in a single project sense, but also in program project sense, so that you can actually start thinking about putting in private finance in a way that is seen as a socially acceptable form.
Yeah, totally.
Right, I'm going to go to Mike now for questions from online.
Thanks, Richard. We've got about a dozen questions, so I'm going to combine a couple here. So these ones are about organisational capability. Martin Ward asks, how do you create and foster the environment within your organisations to promote innovation and entrepreneurship? And then Richard Fisher, a co-founder of an SME that successfully received grant funding, but he's asking what he really needs is mentoring from organisations, and he sees that infrastructure managers like Network Rail and HS2 might be equipped with this capacity, but train operators seem to lack it due to financial constraints. Will GBR be better prepared to aid innovators who are not focused on infrastructure?
So really about your organisations to start with. Who wants to start? Andrew?
My solution to those, as I said, is GBRX until we've managed to create a very different governance framework for the success of Network Rail. You can't regulate Network Rail in the way you regulate it and expect it to have a risk appetite or to do really risky things, because it just doesn't work. What you can do is isolate some of the money in a culture which allows you then to foster that in a much more lab type environment. And I think the same thing absolutely applies then in terms of the train operator community. I mean, it's public money you're spending, so you can't afford to spend it negligently, and you can't afford to spend it on wild speculation either, not least because the returns are rarely sufficient to justify that. But you can create those an opportunity, and that's something we're very, very committed to doing in weeks, not months or years.
I've got more questions.
Yeah, go for it, Mike.
Okay, scale here. From John Carr, the great railways of the Victorian era combined related businesses, hotels, ferries, ships, buses. Even in the 30s, the big four invested in air services. Are there opportunities for the companies that contract with GBR to be multifaceted, for example, in communications or in hydrogen?
Yeah.
And while you ponder that one, then
There's John. Did he stay in a British transport sale in the 1980s? I wonder. I'm not. I'm not a massive fan of diversification there, particularly if you are very heavily dependent on public funds, because your ability to invest in quality, your ability to adapt. I think it's very different if your model, a bit like the Japanese model, actually allows you to use that to leverage investment. But of course, we've already sold off that. So I think the idea of using public money to buy hotels so that GBR could run them is probably not going to be top of the agenda.
Perhaps you could flip that though, maybe thinking about it in the private sector, because I think when we see something like Euston, for example, that's going to potentially, if it works out, look at contributions from parties who will be running office blocks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hotels, people looking at land value capture. And So it's maybe in aggregating our lines of income that actually funds a specific outcome, that we're going to see a diversification across those sources of income and the type of businesses that will
Yep. So
engage in.
today NISTA gets formed, but also today Network Rail takes ownership of London and Continental Railways. It's the first step to create our development company, which brings, and the reason we're doing that is it brings together the Network Rail property arm with the permissions that LCR had to reinvest. And so as a public corporation, it's got much more freedoms. And actually, that's something we've been talking about for 2.5 years. Actually, we've only really got traction on since the new government has said, we see the virtue of this, 50,000 households, in the next 7 years, but also being able to partner with other investors because of the nature of our financial structure.
I mean, that's where we have the diversification.
Yeah.
of it.
Absolutely.
James, you wanted to come on this
Yeah, I
one?
just want to come in on that from a different perspective. So instead of the industry owning assets, there is a model of a marketplace. So the majority of technology worlds that you interact with daily, hourly, minutely, if you're bored, they have created an ecosystem of marketplace. And within there is a commercial model of joint venture and commercial partnership, rather than the need for financial injection or capital injection from the industry side, for example. And I do think, to Julia's point on the financial innovation, the removal of some of the historical regulation around, I'll pick on the ticketing and settlement agreement and the fact that we still deal with ORCATs in the way we did in 1844. If we take that out of the way, come up with a commercial partnership that incentivizes the private sector to drive the revenue growth of which the industry takes a share, is a very different model to expecting the industry to always put its hand in its pocket. And from my perspective in the Rail Supply Group, I'm very clear that we take the risk on the private sector. It's on us to generate the income. We should not be demanding that the public side, and in this case GBR, are the funders. And I don't like work pipeline visibility and all of that sort of stuff. And I really think these commercial models as part of GBR and the open-mindedness to joint ventures and different constructs really should be thought through to open the door to private sector engagement.
Thank you, Tim.
Perhaps slightly different angle on that, because much of that was about, sort of horizontal opportunities. I think there are verticals as well, aren't there?
Yeah.
And look, I see this in freight right now. A number of the global shipping lines are buying railway companies up around, certainly in Europe, and in this country, recently bought Maritime, which essentially is our biggest competitor. But that's creating horizontal alignment, and much of that is about squeezing out margin. It is about improving service to customer. It is about owning the data all the way through. Put that into customer land. Well, of course, the world that we've been in thought that if you ran buses and trains and you wanted to coordinate the timetables, you were being anti-competitive. That's not a joke, is it? I mean, that is the reality of what happens if you try to put buses and trains together in Aldershot or Farnborough or many other places like that. People get very worried about creating a monopoly. Well, it's not a bloody monopoly, is it? What it's trying to do is create a holistic public transport service. If you extend that theory, I think, especially when you then bring in the digital world, that transformation from being it's anti-competitive to know it's a really good thing to do, it will add value. It will allow people to use public transport in a way they can't today. And then, of course, you might find that other companies that only my children would have thought of, whether they're selling coffee or other, there'll be all sorts of other things in that value chain that I can't only guess at, but I know they're going to be there.
Right. Well, I'm afraid to say that that's all we've got time for in the formal panel discussion. Thank you first and foremost to our fantastic panel for their insights today. Innovation and entrepreneurialism have always been central to Rail's story. And I think what this discussion here today has demonstrated is that with the right mix of creativity, investment and policy, they can drive the railway's future. So please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you also to our audience here in the room and also those of you online for joining us today. I should mention that our next event in the Beyond the Rails programme will take place online on the 13th of May, which will be a live 30-minute conversation on the costs of the rail network. Look out for more details in the email you'll receive tomorrow, along with details of how to access the recording of this event. So thank you, all of you, on behalf of Steer for joining us. And for those of you in the room, we now invite you to join us for some drinks, some nibbles, and some further conversation, I am sure. Thank you all.